Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pathfinder by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. I'm your host, Mo Islam, and today I'm joined by one of our very own, Jack Kuhr, Payload's research director. Jack joins us today to talk all things related to SpaceX revenue. We recently published our look-back estimates for the company's 2024 revenue, and today we spent some time breaking down all of the segments and talk a bit about where the business is heading. So let's jump in. Jack, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Always great to have one of our own.
Yeah. We should do this more often.
Yeah, we absolutely need to do this more often, but we have a really great topic today, very topical, very, very top of mind for folks, and tends to be one of our most read articles every time we publish, which is a look into SpaceX's revenue. So I know we've done a lot of estimating and forecasting of the revenue over the last couple of years, but before we jump into that, why don't we, Jack, just, for any new listeners, maybe talk a little bit about yourself. So tell me a little bit about your journey to space, and also how you got to Payload, and then what you do at Payload.
Sure. So, I'm the research director at Payload. Been with Payload writing for the newsletter, writing for the research newsletter for 2 years now. And like yourself, Mo, I came from a finance background. I was working in aerospace and defense, leverage finance, financing private equity acquisitions in the aerospace market. And that was around that was a couple years ago. So that was around the SPAC boom, and we'd start to see more pure play space businesses. Eventually just pivoted more into space, and then teamed up with you guys.
Awesome. You've been doing great work so far, and you also happen to have our fastest growing newsletter, which is our research newsletter. So for those of you who don't and who are not signed up for that, we'll include the link to the show notes. But definitely check out our research publication. It comes out once a week, and Jack does all the writing for it. So anyway, let's talk SpaceX. So I do, before we kind of get into the nitty gritty. Let's first talk about how difficult it is to get SpaceX's financials. So now the company has been relatively close to the vest, but maybe let's take a step back and, how have you kind of constructed the revenue estimates that we've been working on? What sources do you use, and how have you kind of accounted for at times kind of lack of transparency that comes from a private company?
Yeah, that's a good intro on it, because it's important to note that this is not coming from SpaceX or proprietary data internally. This is not a leak that we got. It's a model that me and Mo, so the two of us, have built over a couple years. It's difficult because it's not a public company. We don't have the data, but SpaceX tends to build in the open. Launch is pretty easy to get down because we know how many commercial launches there have been. We know kind of the government revenue, and we can do a pretty simple multiplication of that to get to our launch revenue. Starlink is a lot more difficult, but they do occasionally, they update us on how many customers they have. So Starlink ended the year at 4.6 million customers. We generally know how many aviation customers there are, how many maritime customers there are, what the breakdown is. So we've developed a model to kind of build the revenue, which, by the way, I don't think we said it yet, but the revenue we estimated for 2024 was 13.1 billion. 8.2 billion of that was Starlink revenue. So the vast majority, now it's becoming the vast majority of the revenue is generated from the satellite business. But yeah, it's kind of finding tidbits throughout the internet, plugging it into a model, and refining it year after year. We publish basically our entire model with the assumptions, and love to get kind of community feedback to continue refining it every single year.
Yeah, and then I guess to your point, right, the bottom line is I think that SpaceX does give out enough tidbits and crumbs. They do lay out enough crumbs that allow folks to kind of gather everything and come up with a pretty good picture of the financial profile of the company. On the revenue side, obviously expenses are much more difficult, and we have worked on various sort of internal cost estimates around expenses related to call it Falcon 9 or Starship and individual business segments, but we have yet to kind of put it all together, and we are working on that internally. So maybe one day we will also publish the expense side of things. But we have been doing, Jack, to your point, for the last couple of years, what we've been doing is at the very start of every year, we have published our forecast for what we think the revenue is going to be for the rest of the year. And what we have been doing now, since we've started this, is we'll also do a look back at the year before and refine sort of our projection and get to what we think is a much, much, much more accurate sort of view as to what the revenue is. So, like for example, this year, to your point, the 13.1 billion number. So our latest article was us going back. Now we know how many launches there are. We know how many Falcon 9 commercial versus government versus Starlink versus Starship, and we can back into what those revenue categories are, what they look like, and then same thing for Starlink to your point. But anyway, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty. I'll let you share more about that. But yeah, so it's been really good so far, and I think we've done a pretty accurate job. So actually, you did mention what the revenue is for this year, but talk a little bit about what we had at the beginning of the year. Maybe how close we were. If we
Yeah.
were, yeah,
Yeah, and that's a good self plug too on the look back estimates
yep,
for the last couple of years. The look back estimates at the end of the year have been like scarily on point. Sometimes within like there was one year it was within like $10 million.
yeah,
The forecast, so the forecast we had last year, so this is before the year started. We were pretty accurate. We had, I think it was 13.3 billion. We forecasted 13.3 billion. They came in uh, a little bit. We believe they came in a little bit less than that at 13.1 billion. But we did not anticipate how fast Starlink was going to grow, and we didn't anticipate how SpaceX was going to lower their prices, their terminal prices. So that's a big inhibitor in buying Starlink. Is, hey, if a terminal costs $600, uh, the market is a lot smaller than if the terminal costs $300. So what Starlink did this year is they brought the cost of the terminals down, and that allowed them to grow it, amongst other reasons, allowed them to grow their Starlink customer base very fast this year, and pretty remarkably fast. So we our revenue numbers were correct, but how the build to how we got there was revised for lower our average revenue per user, but higher number of users in the ecosystem.
great. So why don't we actually just kind of run through sort of the numbers segment by segment? In general, obviously, how investors are really anyone in the industry thinking about SpaceX from a financial perspective should look at the companies. There are currently two main business segments, right? Launch and Starlink. Launch business delivers payloads into orbit at around, call it 10x lower cost per ton than most competitors. Starlink has built the world's biggest satellite constellation. I think it's like right now 65% of all operational satellites. So maybe let's walk through launch first. Like, talk a little bit about sort of launch, to kind of the primary drivers and what number we got to with the launch business.
Yeah, so this year or for last year we estimated that they generated $4.2 billion in launch. The primary driver this this past year was the NRO government launch. Obviously, you have Space Force and the DoD and the Pentagon really focusing on space-based capabilities, and you saw it come to fruition last year. I think the NRO had 7 or 8 launches with Falcon 9 SpaceX alone. So that was the big driver. I mean, I think the bigger story is year over year with launch. It's a nice growing business, maybe growing at 20% a year. They're launching a lot of Starlink satellites, which are zero revenue generating businesses. But it's not like the hockey stick doubling every year that you see with Starlink. It's just there's just the demand for launching satellites is in transporter, bandwagon, rideshare. Um, you have nice growth in demand for commercial and government, just with a dedicated Falcon 9 launch, but it's not exponential.
Yep. Yep. And right now, do you have a sense of what percentage of global launch revenue that SpaceX owns?
Well, that's an interesting question because they own around 50% of orbital launch, but call it 70% of their launch is Starlink, their own Starlink satellites, which is zero revenue generating business. So maybe cut that in half, and you can say maybe 25% of revenue, global launch revenue, goes to SpaceX. The rest is going to China. China's the big player here. China, or you have Russia, or Rocket Lab to some extent. But uh, yeah, I mean, a lot of their business is just launching Starlink satellites.
Yeah, and do we have a sense now of what's the average price per launch that SpaceX charges, generally speaking, across the different segments of
Yeah,
Falcon?
that's public information. So that's like 70 million for a standard commercial. If you're a satcom operator, you want to launch a couple satellites or 50 satellites on one in one fairing. That's around 70 million. Government is a little all over the place, but we generally estimated around 90 million. Um, and they are, with having this reusable booster and flying that reusable booster 15 to 20 times, they're able to generate pretty significant gross margin, at least, on these flights.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we had at our investor summit, we had put a chart in that actually you created, Jack, if you recall, which is the launch rate. So launches with new boosters versus flight proven boosters, right? And then basically, that's a very much a hockey stick um, um, chart in that their ability to reuse the flight proven booster has gone up significantly, right? So which would imply that their marginal cost of launch has gone down significantly. Yet, if you look at the price that SpaceX currently charges, it was at 1.62 million and now you're quoting 70. So it's actually gone up despite the fact. So obviously great for SpaceX, their margin profile has increased, but part of that is obviously also due to the fact that there's really no seeming competition at the moment for
Yeah.
those launches.
Do you think that if SpaceX didn't have Starlink, that they would be profitable? Because
That's a really good question. If SpaceX did not have Starlink, would they? Yeah, that's good.
it's an important question for the industry and the rest and rocket competitors. It's like, do you need that application layer, that satellite business, to make a rocket company profitable?
So the short answer. Well, look, profitable is could they have made it profitable? I think probably yes. So I think yes. I mean, ultimately you have to remember, right? Like ULA and some of these other competitors have been charging quadruple, that price, three times to quadruple that price for a number of years. So it's very possible that it just would have been a totally different cost structure. But I do think that the whole the key unlock that SpaceX had and the key perspective is they knew that reusability was going to push the supply curve out. Um, for launch, obviously quite significantly, and that in order for them to build a real business, they needed to be their own demand, right? So they were the ones that actually shifted the demand curve to meet sort of the expansion of supply. So obviously that was a huge, a critical sort of business perspective that made, I think, all the difference. I do want to ask really quickly about Starship. So obviously Starship is very much in its early commercial phases. When do you think it's going to start to make a real financial impact? And has SpaceX alluded to when they're going to start to launch, paying customers?
Yeah, paying customers, I think a while, and like that could be 4 years. I've actually become less confident in that timeline as the last 6 months have progressed. There's just a real strong focus on Moon and Mars. They need to get down orbital refueling. They need to start deploying their own Starlink satellites, which is going to be their financial impact. It's a huge financial impact for them once they can start getting those launched. Um, and then they have to build another fairing, which is a pretty complicated. They have to build and test a whole new fairing. It's kind of like almost like a jaw closing system, that is just going to take R&D and a lot of thought to it. And if it's going to have to be after orbital refueling and after they feel comfortable with Starlink. So I think it's pushed back a little bit, but it is obviously going to be very beneficial to their Starlink business when they can. So for those who don't know, SpaceX is developing an even larger Starlink satellite that has a lot more capacity and that could be put into a Starship fairing or the Starship spacecraft and provide a lot more capacity per launch of those satellites at a much lower cost. So that's gonna be able to really flood the market with capacity and do so at a lower cost to SpaceX.
I was actually just looking at this today, so I actually have the numbers right at my fingertips. So I'm going to go through them. So the V1, Starlink V1, and actually this is a good kind of segue into talking about Starlink. So let's maybe start here. Starlink V1, there's currently about 11 to 1,200 operational V1s. They started launching in November 9, 2019. They weigh about 600 pounds, and they have a bandwidth capacity about 15 gigabits per second per sat. And then you have the V1 and a halves, right? So those started in September 2021. That was 28. There's about 2,800 of those operational today. Those are about 700 pounds, so about 100 pounds more than the V1. So that was 20 gigabits. So that bandwidth is 20 gigabits per second. And then the V2 minis, right? So these are the mini versions of the V2s. So there's about 3,000 of those. Those started launching in February 2023. Those are about 1,800 pounds. Okay, so that's about 3 times the V1. So that bandwidth is about 60 gigabits per second. And then you have the V2s, what you're referring to. So the V2s, TBD launch start date, because they will rely on Starship. Those are 3,000 pounds. Man, I wish I actually wrote down where I got all these numbers. So I hope they're all right. tell me, tell me if any of them don't sound right. But I actually think they're directionally correct. The V2 is about 3,000 pounds and about 100 gigabits per second in bandwidth. Does that all sound right?
Yeah, it's hard for me. I'm now like a kilogram person, so
Oh yeah, that's right. I have it in pounds for our American listeners.
I'll give a good anecdote to understand how much more powerful the next generation satellites are going to be, um, and the capacity that Starship offers. So 6 of those Starship launches with those next generation larger Starlinks. So you get heavier, bigger, more capacity Starlinks, and also you fit more inside Starship because of how much capacity it has. 6 of those launches is the equivalent to 120 Falcon 9 Starlink launches. So that's like let's say you can do six of those Starship launches, maybe at the end of the year. Next year, you can do it in a couple months or theoretically in 1 month. It would take a year and a half to get the equivalent capacity down with Falcon 9 Starlink
Yeah,
launches.
pretty amazing. Yeah, Starship. What an unlock that's going to be when that's ready. Well, okay. So just to recap, right? So launch revenue we have at 4.2 billion for 2024. That's up from 3.5 billion in 2023 that we estimated. Starlink. Let's talk about Starlink high level. Where did we end up with Starlink, and maybe talk about the sub growth so far? What has been your perspective on the sub growth?
Yeah, that's like also like the word sub and subscriber is like a do not touch word with Starlink because they call them customers, and we don't really difficult for us, someone who like follows the industry, to understand what customer means. Theoretically, it's subscriber, but it's like clearly a nuanced word. So they grew. They grew. So I'll start in 2023. They grew by 1.3 million customers to 2.3 million at the end of last year, end of 2 years ago, I guess it'd be. This year, they grew 2.3 million customers. So now that they ended up with 4.6 million customers at the end of this year. And that was really surprising to a lot of people in the industry because they had shown it's a 3-year-old, 4-year-old business, and they'd shown really nice, steady growth 100,000, 120,000 at customer ads a month. And then this year, and like halfway through this year, and there's a variety of different reasons, they just started it. There was just this pickup, and the demand exploded in a way that people weren't expecting. and I think a lot of people, us included, looked at this market because it's a disruptive technology. You don't. It's hard to identify what the market, uh, the TAM of this market could be. Um, and I think this year really showed that this is a really big market, bigger than a lot of people expected. Maybe not what, maybe it's on par with what SpaceX expected, but um, it was a tremendous year of just pure, not even revenue, just pure customers on the network growth, that I think bodes well for the next 5-10 years of the network growing.
How much pricing power have you noticed Starlink having, and how has it sort of evolved?
Yeah, I mean, this is like a this Elon Musk likes to do this with a lot of his companies, but it's pricing is in many ways determined by supply and demand. They play with it a lot, and we talked about this at the onset of this episode. But um, it's there, in places where there's low demand but high capacity, they might lower the pricing to get more people, get more demand, like using Starlink, and then vice versa. If there's a lot of demand but not so much capacity in a specific area, and that happens because remember these satellites are revolving around the world very fast, and you can't just like park one somewhere. Um, then they'll keep the price high and just allow the supply and demand to equalize. So there's not another satcom competitor really that is pushing them on pricing. I would say you
Yes.
have telcos yet, with 100%. There better be one soon. Um, but you have the real competitor to SpaceX now is just going to be is telcos, and you know why not just plug in if you have access to a plug in to a fiber optic uh, system, whether it's here or even in developing countries. They have broadband in many developing countries. You can get broadband for $15 a month.
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
so it's still a rural unconnected service.
So it's actually interesting. Just kind of small side note: when the satellite conference that occurs in DC every year, it's one of the big conferences of the industry. It is really interesting to see how much telco presence, traditional telco presence, is at that conference. I mean, there was always telco presence, but it feels like much more substantial across all of the major names. So I think that there's definitely a little bit of a mix of like fear and opportunity in terms of how the industry is evolving. I am curious, Jack, to get your perspective on across residential, business slash enterprise, maritime, aviation, the variety of different areas of or market segments that Starlink covers. Where do you think Starlink? Where do you think SpaceX? This is probably us maybe doing a little bit of guessing. Where do you think they see the most growth? Like, where are they? Where do you think that they're like really like investing time and resources to really grow?
So this market satcom has been a enterprise business market traditionally, and Starlink, unlike their predecessors, um, just was able to find the marketing, the high quality of service with 100 megabits per second download speeds, and pricing to make this a consumer residential business. So they primarily generate the revenue through someone putting a terminal on their house and just getting that consistent uh, internet connection. The the two main areas of there's a lot of main areas of focus, but I think you're gonna see some diversification away from pure play residential because you have direct to sell, which they just announced. The T-Mobile had a commercial in the Super Bowl last night um, about this. They have the direct to sell that's going to start proliferating, and people are going to have access to the network through that. Um, Rome is a really big one. They introduced their Starlink Mini this year, so this is particularly in like developing worlds. This is really important. This is a terminal that is the size of a notebook or a laptop that you can just put in your backpack and take it wherever, and then set it up and connect to the internet. So that's a real like internet anywhere terminal, and that segment is growing very fast. Um, and then you just have, there's this catch up with business and military where it takes a couple, consumers buy immediately, and the sales cycle for a business is going to take a little longer. So I think there's a lot of these kind of side businesses that are going to grow maybe disproportionately fast.
Yeah. Um, how scalable do you think Starlink is? And do you think we can get to 50 million plus customers, or do you think there's a saturation point at some point?
After this year, I'm more confident in how big this market is.
Hmm.
This is internet is a huge market, one of the
Yeah, of
biggest
course.
out there. Um, but there is a lot of room to grow, and this is a global business. We haven't even entered in the India market, which is going to make up a huge percentage of this company's revenues. That could happen any month or this year. Uh, so yeah, 50 million is. I think it's eventually. I think that's definitely a number to keep in mind and look out for. And I think it's quite possible we'll be able to do that. And that's, I mean, if you're talking about uh, including direct to sell, then you get to that number a lot faster because they're going to be able to onboard through T-Mobile or Verizon or AT&T at obviously a lower dollar price point, so lower revenue per user. Uh, they're going to get a lot of connections to that, and then later down the line they can use that direct to sell, direct to device technology to have the Internet of Things and start connecting vehicles and cities and anything that moves really. Um, so you have these layers that there's a lot of room for them to run here.
Yeah. No, it's a great point, and I do think that getting to that 50 million plus customer base will be a lot of it will be this mobile Starlink subcategory, which includes like phones and cars and IoT devices. Obviously, much lower ARPU, average revenue per user on those, much lower, but much higher volume, right? So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I do want to talk really quick about bandwidth because we've gotten that question before around, from various folks around like, hey, do you think Starlink has sort of the right bandwidth for its sub growth, customer growth, excuse me, not sub growth, customer
Yeah,
growth.
yeah,
And we did an internal analysis on Starlink bandwidth, and I will caveat this is not Jack approved, so if it's wrong, you can blame me. But I look so one of the things we had a question from an investor about what do we think about the Starlink bandwidth, and I did some back of the envelope work. Basically looking at kind of every single I looked at the number of V1 satellites, looking at the bandwidth per satellite, and looking at sort of across the V1, the V1 and a half, and the V2 minis, and effectively, what you get to is about 256 terabits per second of total bandwidth, and then you want well, then so okay, so that's like the total possible bandwidth capacity of the system currently, and then you obviously have to look at what's actually usable, and like what's the true capacity. So then you look at like land area, the actual percentage of that land that's populated, performance improvements from the inter satellite links. And you actually get to a true capacity of more like kind of like 15 to 20 terabits per second, which actually is right in line, interestingly, with how many what the bandwidth requirement is for 4.6 million subs. So right now it feels like the system is not constrained. But of course, it will need Starship up and running soon to get the V2s up to really expand that capacity. By the way, this is a analysis that we will publish in the future in a future payload research. We've sort of kept it in our back pocket, and we'll do some more work and test a lot of the assumptions and the numbers that I've laid out. But that'll be an interesting one for us to look at. Okay, I do want to just in the interest of time talk a little bit about the other category. We do have an other category that is obviously not as big as launch and Starlink, but maybe talk a little bit about what that revenue makeup is, Jack, and what that revenue is, and then what the makeup of that revenue is.
yeah. So that if I'm correct, so the that other category is $720 million. The majority of that comes from HLS, a human landing system. So that's the NASA contract that's paid out in increments every month. There's another 50 million, $100 million deposit into SpaceX's bank account for this. That is for the system that's going to bring us to moon, and to Mars, and that's just consistent revenue that comes in from NASA. We don't categorize it as launch because it's maybe we could eventually, frankly, but it's kind of interesting to put it as a side category. Um, and then there's other kind of, you know, small NASA contracts. They had the tipping point last year, and there's little small things, accessories that make up the rest of that category.
Awesome. And yeah, so kind of together across all those three segments, we get to 13.1 billion. And obviously that article's out there. So for those of you guys who want more detail, you can check it out online and send us an email on feedback if you think we're wrong or if there's anything that we missed. Definitely don't hesitate. But
That was
Jack,
up. Well, I think that was up from 8.7 billion, if I
correct.
recall,
Yeah, 8.7.
last year. So that's
Yep,
kind of 8.7 to 13.1, and we're currently working on the forecast for this year.
correct. Exactly. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of our time together talking a little bit about some speculative things in the future. Definitely, feel free. And I don't know if we're going to align on all of these questions, but I'm definitely kind of curious to get your perspective. All right, question one: do we think that Starship is going to make Falcon 9 obsolete?
It definitely will make Falcon 9, and SpaceX has said that as well. It'll be maybe 6 to 8 years of operations until they move everything into that's crewed launches, that's Starlink launches, that's everything. It'll be a Starship company. And by the way, that is a something that I've been thinking through a fair amount in the last couple of months. That represents, without Falcon 9 and the lower capacity, that represents a really interesting opportunity for other rocket competitors to finally come in and take on that the medium launch market, medium to heavy launch market. So that's a Neutron, Rocket Lab's Neutron. Maybe New Glenn is getting high up there too, but you have MLV from Firefly. There's an opportunity to take that vacuum that'll be created when Falcon 9 is gone.
Well, okay. So I was going to ask next. What do we think are the biggest financial winners and losers when Starship becomes fully operational? Okay, so it sounds like one of the winners will be these small to medium lift launch vehicles, where it might be a market segment that Starship just doesn't care about. SpaceX doesn't care about. Also, Starship isn't really super optimized for geo, direct to geo. So there's that too. But okay, so then maybe those are some winners. Any thoughts on any losers when Starship becomes fully operational? Who loses on this
If
in
you
this trade?
have if you have a uh, not a fully expendable rocket, I think you're dead in the water. I mean, that's an obvious for this market, like in totality. Um, I think Kuiper is going to have a chance here. They will have a chance. You need two mega constellations. I mean, the government needs to have some diversity in their suppliers first and foremost. Um, but yeah, the other satcom players that are hanging in the weeds, maybe a OneWeb is going to probably struggle once they get more capacity on the market. But I think in general, there's a lot. I think in general, this is a winner's game right here because it. We talk about this a lot, Mo, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. But um, we don't know what we don't know, and when you bring the cost per kilogram down as substantially as the Starship probably will eventually do, um, design strengths can change completely, new innovations emerge, new businesses are built, and the whole market grows more than it detracts from some players.
Yeah. Well, so I have a kind of related, interesting question. I'd be surprised if you have a strong view around it, but I got to ask it, which is when Starship becomes fully operational, and we're alluding to this a little bit. Obviously, Falcon 9 potentially goes obsolete. They've already said that it's very SpaceX has already kind of indicated this. How do you think? Do you think that the cost per kilogram could drop so much? Because the estimates put it at between 10 to 30x lower than what costs are right now. Do you think that demand will make up for the lost cost per kilogram? And could it be so significant that revenue actually decreases in launch?
Interesting. That's an interesting question. That's an interesting question. I think in the near term they'll price Starship launches at what Falcon 9 is, and
Yeah.
then they're not going to bring it down to 10 million or 20 million a launch, which is, you know, what they've alluded to in the past. Maybe that would be their internal cost, but they still want to get, maybe their internal cost is 10 million, but they still are charging 60, 70 million. Um, it's quite possible, but frankly, this is like becoming a Starlink business, and that lost revenue means very little compared to as a percentage of the total revenue, right? I mean, right now, launch is, I don't know, maybe 30% of the total revenue. Maybe in a year it's 25%. Maybe eventually it's 10%. Uh, so yeah, it's quite possible. It's quite possible, but I think that would be good for everybody.
Yeah, but I also think you're right, which is that even I think to our earlier point, even though reusability and the number of booster reuses have substantially increased, costs have not come down. So it's very possible that without increased competition, that the cost per kilogram isn't really going to go down as much as people think. Okay, I am curious. SpaceX going public. This is something people have been talking about for a while. Who knows, right? I'm not going to sit here, and I don't think we need to predict whether SpaceX will be a public company or not. Probably, most likely not. Most likely, if there's any kind of public market for SpaceX, it will be a Starlink spinout. In which case, there's so many different questions of like, okay, well, what does then SpaceX have to charge Starlink, and what does that do to profitability, and all these things, and what does it do to Starlink business? I think these are all a lot of open-ended questions. But I am kind of curious, like, if SpaceX were a public company today, how do you think investors would react to some of these revenue figures, and where the valuation is today? Any kind of thoughts? Any strong thoughts around that?
Well, the revenue is going to be way lower than your aerospace primes, your Boeings and Lockheeds of the world, but they just have space. I mean, a lot of the times, investors look at what the competitive moat is, and then they'll look at the market size here, and the potential market size, one of space, but also just like internet, is really quite big. That it would be plus like Elon mania kind of thing would give it a boost on the public markets, but uh, yeah, I mean it's going to be a Starlink spin out maybe after Starship is up and running and they can finally get the economics on that looking really good. And then maybe you probably should look at it more like a telco than a aerospace prime. Um, Telcos obviously have to spend a lot of money building the fiber optic cables and advertising because they have a lot of competitors, whereas Starlink has less competitors. So I think they're going to look at the total number of customers and then just the margins they're able to generate off that.
Yeah, no, I think I know. I think there's a lot of things that have to. No, you're absolutely right. There's a lot that still has to go according to plan. Of course, I mean, at its latest tender, I think the latest tender is around 350 billion, which if you go backwards looking, that's about 27 times sales, assuming that our estimates are correct. And even if you assume, let's just say, a 50% revenue growth for this year, which gets us which gets them from like 13 to call it 20, 19 and a half, 20 billion, that's still 18 times sales. And I was actually looking at this today. Nvidia is trading, Nvidia, which has growing about 100% a year, with about 50% EBITDA margins, right? Not gross margins, EBITDA margins. Nvidia is trading around 18 times sales. So, and there's a lot of people that think Nvidia is very is priced very very aggressively. So kind of interesting. It's just sort of like a back of the envelope. You know, SpaceX, Nvidia on a enterprise value to sales multiple, very similar, but obviously Nvidia has a much more interesting growth profile right now, based on what we can see. Obviously, if you actually kind of dovetails into my next question, which is like, if you had to bet on one of the SpaceX revenue streams being 10x bigger in 10 years, what would it be? And feel free to like tie in a revenue stream that doesn't actually exist yet, but
All right,
curious to get your perspective on that.
yeah, I mean, I could obviously say direct to sell because that's an easy one. I will say I'll take a contrarian view that that people in the industry, even in the spaceflight industry, don't agree with. But I do think uh, the market for crewed missions, if they really want to push it, and if they want to pack up a Starship with, not just 5 people, but maybe 20 people, I think that could eventually be an interesting market, um, that has some legs to it, and that's kind of like every sci-fi, every anyone who works in the space industry eventually dreams of that moment where like crude actually becomes a business and it's not horrifically expensive to go to space. Um, but that's a side interesting one. But yeah, the big one that they're focusing on now is Rome and the Starlink Mini. They can just it's easy, if you want to go. It's easy to bring them into communities in developing countries, which make up a much bigger market than the U.S. is going to make up. Uh, and I know that's a product they've been working on and really excited about for a while. And I think you can just see that proliferating. Just this idea of having a terminal in your backpack and you can just have it wherever you go. That's super exciting.
I'm going to give you a little layup. Do you think SpaceX has what it takes to be the first $1 trillion space company?
I think my guess is if it was on the public markets today, it would run up to something similar to that level, just because of
Wow,
the.
really?
I mean, just because just mania. I mean, not based off fundamentals.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
People often say the Starlink IPO would be in that 300, 400 billion-dollar market cap, but um, there is it is the new frontier, and there's a whole space economy that is built based on SpaceX, um, and yeah, I think I think public demand for an asset like that, it would be pretty high.
Yeah, amazing. Well, we'll certainly be following along, and Jack, you continue to do great work. So thanks so much for being on the show. We should definitely do this more often. So I
Yeah,
think every time we publish one of these things, I think it makes sense for us to jump on and chat about it. And I'll say to some of the listeners, there are quite a bit of things that we cannot really talk about for a variety of reasons. So for anyone who really wants to dig deep, feel free to email myself and Jack, or just Jack, who's been really in the nitty gritty of all this. But yeah, Jack, thanks so much for being on the show. Any final kind of SpaceX comments before we go?
no, this has been fun, Mo. I agree. We definitely should do this more often. We have a lot of these interesting research related analysis and reports that we can just nerd out on. But
Yeah,
appreciate you having fun.
absolutely. And stay tuned for the 2025 projections, which will be coming out in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that. And with that, Jack, thanks so much for being on the show. And until next time.
Thanks a lot, Mo.